The highway doesn't forgive mistakes. It never has. On Route 9, where the asphalt cracks like old skin and the guardrails have been bent so many times, nobody bothers straightening them anymore. The sun was bleeding out behind the hills when it happened. A child walking alone, a motorcycle screaming at 90 miles an hour. Then, silence. Then, fire. The Iron Mercy Riders had ridden these roads for 30 years, and every law enforcement agency in 3 counties had tried to erase them. None succeeded. But an 8-year-old girl with grass-stained knees and a backpack shaped like a frog, she was about to do what no badge, no judge, no courtroom ever could. She was about to make Silas Crowe remember he was still human. If this story already has you hooked, subscribe to the channel right now, hit that like button, and drop your city and country in the comments below. I want to see how far this ride takes us. Don't go anywhere. This is only the beginning. The backpack was lime green. That was the detail that would stay with Silas for the rest of his life. Not the sound of his bike leaving the road, not the white-hot tear through his ribs where the handlebar punched in and refused to leave. Not the way the gravel took his left forearm down to raw meat when he hit the shoulder. The lime green backpack, shaped like a frog, sitting perfectly upright beside a little girl who was kneeling in broken glass and motorcycle debris without a single tremor in her small brown hands. He had been doing 78 when the deer stepped out. That was what he would tell the paramedics. What he would tell nobody was that he had been riding fast because slow gave his mind too much room to work, and his mind had been working against him for 11 months straight. 11 months since the vote that split the Iron Mercy Riders down the center. 11 months since a man named Garrett Pell had walked into his life carrying a proposition wrapped in money and covered in things Silas didn't want to touch. 11 months of Silas saying no, and the consequences of that no arriving in ways that left tire tracks through everything he'd spent 22 years building. He'd been heading nowhere specific, just Route 9. The kind of road where the world forgets to look. The bike was destroyed. The Harley Fat Boy he'd rebuilt from a stripped frame over 3 winters, welded by hand, every bolt checked twice. It was a crumpled mass of chrome and German steel, half buried in the roadside ditch, one wheel still spinning with the slow, stupid persistence of something that hadn't gotten the message yet. Silas was on his back in this gravel. The handlebar had gone in just below his lowest rib on the right side. He could feel it there, occupying space that belonged to his insides. He knew enough about wounds to know he wasn't going to die in the next 3 minutes. He also knew enough to know he shouldn't try to move. The sky above Route 9 was the color of a bruise healing badly. He heard boots, small ones, crunching through debris, and then the little girl's face appeared above him, blocking out the dying sun. She had dark eyes, the kind that processed information fast and showed none of the panic that the situation called for. She looked at the handlebar. She looked at his face. She looked at the blood spreading through his cut-off vest and soaking into the gravel beneath him. "That's in you," she said. Not a question. "Yeah," Silas said. "Does it hurt?" He almost laughed. His chest rattled instead. "What are you doing on this road alone?" "Walking home." She set the frog backpack down beside her and knelt without ceremony, the way a child kneels when they've already decided they're staying. "Where's your phone?" "Inside pocket, left side, don't—" But she was already reaching into his vest with careful, deliberate fingers, not flinching at the blood soaking the leather, finding the phone by touch and pulling it free. She dialed 911 with practiced efficiency, gave the mile marker, described the injury with a precision that made the dispatcher ask twice if there was an adult present. "I'm the adult present," Maya Rowan said. She was 8 years old, Silas Crowe, 53, president of the Iron Mercy Riders, veteran of 2 wars and 22 years of outlaw territory, tried to tell her to step back, tried to say that the blood on her hands wasn't something a child should carry. What he said instead, in the voice that had made grown men go quiet in rooms full of weapons, was, "Men like me don't deserve saving." Maya looked at him without expression for a long moment. Then she pressed both her small hands flat against the wound around the handlebar. Not pulling, not pushing, just covering it, holding pressure the way someone had clearly taught her, and said, "You don't get to decide that." He didn't speak again until the sirens came. Check. 3 weeks later, Silas walked out of Mercy General Hospital in Palmdale, with 18 stitches below his right lung, a compression wrap around his torso, and discharge paperwork he didn't read. The physical therapist had explained the recovery protocol. He had nodded at appropriate intervals. He had no intention of following it. What he had every intention of doing was finding out who the little girl was. That had been easier than expected. Small town adjacent to Route 9, Gila Bend Junction, a place so uninteresting the map sometimes forgot to include it. The girl's name was Maya Rowan, age 8, third grade at Jefferson Elementary. Mother, Elena Rowan, 31, employed at the diner on Crescent Avenue and also cleaning houses on weekends because the diner money didn't stretch far enough. No father listed on record. No family nearby. The two of them, alone in a rental house on Millbrook Street with a landlord who'd been threatening to raise the rent for 4 months, and a car that needed a water pump it hadn't gotten yet. Iron Mercy had people who could find things. That wasn't the impressive part. The impressive part was what Silas did with the information. He came on a Tuesday morning before Elena's first shift. 31 bikers. Not roaring up the street, rolling in slowly, engines at idle, leather jackets and road dust, parking along Millbrook in a line that stretched half a block. Silas in front. No weapons visible, no aggression in the posture. Just 31 large, scarred, weathered men sitting on their motorcycles in front of a small rental house at 7:15 in the morning, waiting. Elena Rowan opened the front door and went completely still. She was a woman who had learned, through practice, not to show fear. Single mothers in Gila Bend Junction developed that skill early, or they didn't survive the dynamics of the place. But the sight of 31 bikers parked outside her house tested the limits of that skill in ways that showed briefly across her face before she locked it back down. Silas got off his bike, walked to the edge of the front path, stopped there, not advancing, not backing off. "Your daughter saved my life," he said. His voice was low, unhurried, the voice of a man who didn't need volume to make a room pay attention. "I wanted to say thank you in person." Elena looked past him at the line of bikes and men. Her jaw was set. "She's 8. I know. She should have been on that road alone. She shouldn't have been. No." He didn't offer anything more than that. Didn't explain, didn't deflect. Elena stared at him, at the scar that ran from his left ear to his jaw, at the Iron Mercy Rider's patch on his chest, the skull and compass logo that featured in at least 2 county-level law enforcement briefings she'd overheard in the diner, at the way he stood, weight-balanced, hands visible, nothing aggressive in his posture, but nothing soft either. Like a man who had been dangerous for so long he'd forgotten how to be anything else, but was currently choosing, deliberately, not to be. "She doesn't need to know your name," Elena said. "She already does. She gave the paramedics her name. They told me." "Then she doesn't need to know you came here." Silas nodded slowly. "That's fair." He reached into his cut and produced an envelope, plain, white, sealed. Set it on the top of the fence post between them without pushing it toward her. "For the inconvenience," he said. Elena looked at the envelope like it was something that might bite. "We don't need your money." "It's not mine." He paused. "It's from the brothers. Their idea. I'm just delivering it." He walked back to his bike, and then he did something Elena Rowan did not expect. He waited. All 31 of them waited, engines off now, watching the house. Not in a threatening way. In the way of men who had decided something and were patient about it. Elena picked up the envelope. Inside was $1,200 in cash and a single index card with a phone number and 2 words, "We watch." She almost called the police. She didn't call the police. Not because she trusted the bikers. She didn't, not remotely, not yet. But because the police in Gila Bend Junction were a particular flavor of useless that Elena Rowan had encountered before. Deputy Haynes, who had responded to her noise complaint about the neighbors 6 months ago, had spent 20 minutes explaining to her why the situation wasn't quite a legal matter yet, while making clear through posture and tone that a single mother in a rental property on Millbrook Street didn't have the same weight as a homeowner would have had. Sheriff Dubrow, who Elena had met exactly once at a town meeting, had the eyes of a man counting the days to his pension and subtracting everything that might complicate the count. The $1,200 fixed the water pump. There was still money left over. She kept the index card. Maya didn't know about any of it, not at first. What Maya knew was that school was long, that her mother worked hours that meant Maya walked home alone 3 times a week, and that the walk from Jefferson Elementary along the edge of Route 9 to Millbrook Street was 45 minutes of landscape so boring it made her brain itch. She had taken to counting things, fence posts, road reflectors, dead moths on the shoulder, and constructing elaborate theories about the lives of people who drove past without stopping. She had not, until 3 weeks after the accident on Route 9, noticed the motorcycle. Not one of the loud, pack-style motorcycles that sometimes move through town in groups. This was a single bike, dark matte finish, parked on the far side of the gas station at the edge of Jefferson Road, the rider just sitting. Not pumping gas, not looking at his phone, just sitting, facing the direction she walked. She noticed it on a Monday. It was there on Wednesday. On Friday, it was parked a quarter-mile further along her route, on the shoulder near the Morrow's grain storage building, same rider in the same jacket. She was 8, not oblivious. The next Wednesday, she walked to within 15 feet of the parked bike and the rider on it and said, without preamble, "Are you following me?" The rider was a man in his mid-40s, built like a refrigerator someone had upholstered in leather and road grime. He had a beard the color of wet concrete and eyes that were assessing her the way a working dog assesses a situation. Not aggressive, not warm, just precise. "Watching," he said. "What's the difference?" He thought about it. "Following means I'm going where you go. Watching means I'm here when you pass." Maya considered this. "Who told you to watch?" "Silas?" She had not heard that name spoken, but she knew it immediately. The way you know the name of someone you've already met. The information completing a shape that was already there. The man from the highway. The one with the handlebar. "Is he okay?" she asked. The large man on the motorcycle seemed to recalibrate something, like he'd prepared for several versions of this conversation, and this wasn't any of them. "He's walking," he said finally. "That's not the same as okay." The man, she would later learn his name was Boone, road name Boone, no other name offered, looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a person who has encountered something they lack the proper category for. Then he said, "No, it's not." They looked at each other across 15 feet of roadside gravel. Then Maya said, "I'm going to tell my mom." "That's fine," Boone said. He said it like it had already been factored in. Elena's reaction was not fine exactly. But it was complicated by the fact that Maya had come home and immediately described a large man on a motorcycle who had been honest with her, not threatening, not intrusive, and had let her walk away without comment. Elena drove the route the following morning and found Boone parked exactly where Maya described, doing exactly nothing threatening, and when Elena pulled over and walked up to him with her arms crossed and her voice doing the specific dangerous calm thing it did when she was furious, he said, "Ma'am, we're not here to scare you. We're here because Silas asked us to make sure she gets home." "Why?" Elena demanded. Boone's jaw moved slightly. "Because there have been some cars." "What cars?" "Cars that don't belong on this road. Watching the school, watching your house. Started about a week after Silas came out of the hospital." He paused. "Silas has enemies. He didn't want them to become your problem. He's trying to keep distance between his world and yours. But the distance doesn't work if we're not watching the gap." The cold that moved through Elena Rowan then was not the California winter morning cold. It was older and more specific. It was the cold of a woman who has been managing alone for so long that even the news of danger registers first as another logistical problem she now has to solve by herself. "What kind of enemies?" she said. Boone looked at her steadily. "The kind that know how to use civilians." Elena stood on the gravel shoulder of Jefferson Road for a long moment. The water pump under her hood made a healthy, functional sound, no longer the sick, grinding rattle it had been doing for 3 months. She thought about the $1,200. She thought about the index card. She thought about Maya's hands pressed flat against a stranger's wound without a tremor. "I want to talk to Silas," she said. Boone took out his phone. Silas met her at the Iron Mercy Clubhouse on the edge of town. A converted auto body garage on industrial land, the kind of building that looked abandoned from the road and was clearly not. He met her at the chain-link fence, not inside. He had chosen that deliberately. Inside felt like a claim. The fence felt like neutral ground. He looked worse than she expected, which was interesting because she had expected bad. He was bigger than she'd registered from the front door. 6'2" maybe, with the kind of frame that suggested he'd been carrying heavy things for decades. The scar on his face was the color of old wax. He walked with a slight torque in his upper body that said the stitches were healed, but the muscle underneath hadn't caught up yet. He looked like a man who hadn't slept more than 4 hours in recent memory. "Tell me about the cars," Elena said. No greeting. She didn't have time for preamble and wasn't going to pretend she did. Silas leaned against the fence post and told her, cleanly, without editorializing. A rival organization, he called them the Wrecking Tide, said the name like it tasted bad, had been pushing into Iron Mercy territory for 8 months. They operated differently from the bikers. They were not interested in road culture or brotherhood or any of the code that the Iron Mercy had, imperfectly, tried to live by. They were interested in routes, the kind you move things along, not things you'd want to talk about in daylight. Silas had refused the arrangement that would have made them allies. That refusal had a price. The price had been arriving slowly, in the form of property damage and missing people, and now, apparently, surveillance of people connected to Silas in any visible way. "She's not connected to you," Elena said. "She happened to be on a road." "I know that. They don't." He paused. "Or they do and they don't care. Which is worse." Elena looked at him, really looked. The kind of looking you do when you're trying to determine if someone is telling the truth and how much of the truth. She'd been doing this her whole adult life. She was good at it. He wasn't lying. He was also not telling her everything. But the part he was telling her was real, and the fear underneath it, not fear for himself, she registered that specifically, was real. "Why does a girl who helped you on a highway matter enough to warrant protection detail?" Elena said. "You don't know her. She's nobody to you." Something moved in Silas Crowe's face. A shift so small it was almost invisible, the kind of shift that happens when a word lands on something sore. He was quiet for a moment. The industrial park around them made its sounds. A distant compressor, traffic on the highway, a mile west, wind moving through the chain link. "I had a daughter," he said finally. "She's 22 now. She doesn't know who I am. I made sure of that." He stopped. "Maya reminded me of something I spent 20 years trying to forget." Elena said nothing. "I'm not trying to become part of your life," he said. "I'm trying to keep my life from becoming part of yours. There's a difference." The cold was back. Sharper this time. Because Elena Rowan was standing in a gravel lot in front of a scarred, exhausted biker, telling her that her daughter was in proximity to danger she'd had no part in creating, and the man responsible for that proximity was the same man offering, imperfectly, to be the wall between Maya and it. She should have said no. Every rational thing she'd learned about surviving as a woman alone said to say no, to take Maya and disappear somewhere the ripples from this man's life couldn't reach. She thought about the water pump, about the index card, about the cars Boone had described, and the specific chill of knowing someone had been watching the school. "What's the play?" she said. Silas blinked, like he'd expected different. "You said they're already watching, so the distance strategy isn't working." She looked at him steadily. "What's the actual plan?" He studied her for a moment with an expression that was not quite respect and not quite surprise, but lived somewhere between them. Then he pushed off the fence post and said, "Come inside. I'll show you." Elena Rowan followed Silas Crowe through the chain-link gate into the Iron Mercy clubhouse. Not because she trusted him, and not because she had run out of options, but because somewhere between Boone's honest eyes on a gravel shoulder and this man's voice saying she reminded me of something I spent 20 years trying to forget, somewhere in that narrow space, she had decided that the most dangerous thing she could do right now was face this alone. The gate clanged shut behind her, and across the industrial lot, parked on the far shoulder of the access road where the streetlight didn't reach, a dark sedan with no plates and 2 men in the front seat watched her walk inside. One of them took out a phone. Dialed. "She went in," he said. The voice on the other end was quiet, unhurried, the way of someone who has already decided how this ends and is simply watching the pieces arrange themselves. "Good," it said. "Let her get comfortable." The call ended. The sedan didn't move. Inside the chain-link fence, Maya Rowan's mother was learning the shape of a war she hadn't started. And outside it, The people who intended to use her daughter as leverage were already doing the math on exactly when to collect. The clubhouse smelled like motor oil, old coffee, and something underneath both of those things that Elena couldn't name, but recognized instinctively as the smell of men who had been living with tension for so long. It had become a physical property of the air around them. She stood just inside the main room and took inventory the way she always took inventory of new spaces. Exits first, then obstacles, then the people. 3 exits. The front door she'd come through. A side door propped open with a cracked helmet. A roll-up garage door at the far end, currently closed. Obstacles. 2 pool tables, both in use. A long workbench covered in bike parts along the left wall. Mismatched chairs arranged around a central table big enough to seat 12. The people, 11 men she could see immediately, ranging from mid-30s to what looked like late 60s, all wearing the Iron Mercy cut, all of whom had paused at some point in whatever they were doing to register her presence without making it obvious they were registering her presence. That last part, the controlled, practiced non-staring, was more unsettling than open scrutiny would have been. Silas moved through the room without ceremony, and she followed, and the room resumed its sounds around her as if she were already a known quantity. Which meant, she realized, that Silas had told them she was coming before he came out to meet her. Which meant the invitation had been extended before she arrived. Which meant she had, at some point between parking her car and walking up to the chain link, already been evaluated and cleared for this. That should have bothered her more than it did. He took her to a back room, an office, loosely defined, with a metal desk and a corkboard on the wall that had been cleared of whatever had been pinned to it recently, the ghost outlines of paper edges visible against the cork. He put a folded map on the desk between them, then a printed photograph, then another. He didn't sit. Neither did she. The photographs were surveillance images, grainy, taken from distance, clearly shot from inside a vehicle. The first showed the exterior of Jefferson Elementary at pickup time. The second showed her car, parked at the diner. The third showed her front door on Millbrook Street from an angle that required the photographer to have been in the vacant lot across the road, which was not a public space. Her throat went tight. She didn't let it reach her face. "Where did you get these?" she said. "One of my guys spotted the tail on Wednesday, followed him back to a lot on Garfield, found a camera set up in the bed of a pickup, prepaid phone attached to a GoPro, triggered remotely. These are what was on the card." Silas tapped the edge of the photograph of the school. "They've been running this for at least 6 days before we found it." 6 days. Maya had been walking home on those days. Elena had driven this route, dropped her coffee, at the light on Crescent, had a conversation with Mrs. Delacroix about the 3rd grade science project, all of it watched, all of it photographed, and she had noticed nothing. "What do they want?" Elena said. Her voice was level. She was proud of that. "To get to me," Silas said. "Through you." He paused. "That's the crude version. The finer version is that Garrett Pell, the man running the Wrecking Tide, is not interested in winning a fight. He's interested in winning a position. He needs Iron Mercy's route structure. The roads, the contacts, the infrastructure we've built over 20 years. He's been trying to buy it. When I said no, he started trying to break it. Breaking the Brotherhood means breaking me. Breaking me means finding the thing I can't walk away from." He stopped. The fluorescent light above the desk buzzed faintly with the specific frequency of a tube that needed replacing and had been ignored. "She's 8 years old," Elena said. "She doesn't know you." "He doesn't care." Silas's voice didn't change register, but something in it went flat and specific in a way that made the hair on Elena's arms move. "Pell doesn't use pain. He uses obligation. He'll take someone, and then he'll call, and the call will be very polite, and he'll explain what returning them costs." Elena looked at the photographs again, the one of her front door. She thought about the angle, the vacant lot, how long someone had been standing there with a remote trigger and patience. "I'm going to ask you something," she said, "and I need you to answer it straight." "Okay. Is Maya safer if I take her and leave? Right now, tonight. Go somewhere he doesn't know." Silas was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. "I don't know," he said. It was the right answer. It was the honest answer. It terrified her more than a confident no would have. "Because he might already have enough on your patterns to predict where you'd go," Silas said. "Or he might not. I can't tell you. What I can tell you is that if you stay, I can put people on the house, on the school, on every point between. What I can't tell you is whether that makes it better or just makes it visible. Elena pressed her palms flat on the desk, looked at the map, looked at the photographs, looked at the man across from her who was telling her the truth in pieces because he didn't have it all himself, and who was doing it with the kind of stripped-down honesty that she associated with people who had run out of the energy required for deception. "I'll stay for now," she said. "I want a number I can call directly, not Boone's, yours." He wrote it on the edge of the map without hesitation. She took the map, folded it, put it in her jacket pocket, and walked back through the clubhouse without looking at anyone. At the door she stopped, turned back. "Silas." He had followed her to the edge of the back room. He stopped in the doorway. "If anything happens to her," Elena said, "there will not be a version of events where I don't hold you responsible." He didn't flinch, didn't argue, just looked at her with those exhausted, particular eyes and said, "I know." She left. The chain-link gate clanged behind her. She sat in her car for 3 minutes before she trusted her hands enough to drive. The meeting that no one was supposed to know about happened at 6 the following morning in the parking lot of a closed tire shop on Route 12, which was far enough from the clubhouse that Silas only found out about it because Decker, 26, newest patch, loose jaw and looser judgment, had left his bike there and taken a rideshare back, and one of the older members had noticed the GPS tracker Silas ran on all club vehicles showing the Fat Bob sitting cold on Route 12 from midnight forward, 7 of them, all patched members, all men who had been in the Brotherhood longer than 5 years. And Decker, who had been in for 14 months and apparently had opinions about his proximity to a war he hadn't signed up for. Silas drove out there alone. They were still standing in the lot when he pulled in. He cut the engine and sat for a moment on the bike, not because he was composing himself, he didn't need to, but because the moment of sitting was a message in itself. "I'm not in a hurry, I'm not worried, I know what this is." He got off the bike and walked to the middle of the group the way you walk into the center of something you built and know every inch of. The 7 men looked at him with varying degrees of the thing that wasn't quite guilt and wasn't quite defiance, but shared properties with both. Crowbar. Real name Carol Briggs, road captain for 11 years, man who had broken 3 ribs at Flagstaff in 2019 and ridden 40 miles on them before mentioning it, was the one who spoke first, which meant he'd been selected to, which meant this was structured. "We need to talk about the wrecking tide situation," Crowbar said. "I can see that," Silas said. "Pell has made an offer, a real one." Crowbar's voice was careful and direct, the voice of a man who has rehearsed enough to get through it cleanly, but not so much that it sounded rehearsed. "Route access, with a cut of everything running north of the 80. Nobody has to fight, nobody has to move. We just become his distribution chain," Silas said. "We become partners," Decker said, and his voice had the particular edge of a young man who has convinced himself he is being realistic when he is being afraid. Silas looked at Decker for a long moment. Decker was 26 and had come into the Brotherhood from a failed construction business and an ex-wife and a drinking problem he'd mostly addressed. He'd proven useful and shown genuine loyalty in 11 of the 14 months he'd been patched. He had also, apparently, decided that the geometry of the current situation favored accommodation. "Partners," Silas said, "with Garrett Pell." "We'd be protected," Decker said. "The surveillance on the woman and the kid would stop. We go back to what we were. We were never what he needs us to be," Silas said. His voice was still level. That was a deliberate choice, and the men who'd been with him long enough recognized it as such, and went very still. "Pell doesn't want partners. He wants infrastructure he doesn't have to maintain or protect. The second he has what we've built, we become liability, loose ends with motorcycles and long memories." "That's one reading," Crowbar said. "What's yours?" The silence in the tire shop parking lot was thick with cold morning air and exhaust residue and the specific weight of men having a conversation they couldn't take back. "My reading," Crowbar said carefully, "is that we have 2 prospects and a mechanic's apprentice who are not patched members, which means they are not protected by Brotherhood code if this goes sideways. My reading is that the surveillance on the Rowan house means Pell is already inside the distance we thought we had. My reading is that we are 7 men down from our peak count, and the 4 who left last spring left because they saw this coming before we did." Silas looked at him. Crowbar held the look. 11 years of road captaining, 11 years of running point on every logistics problem the Iron Mercy had generated. Crowbar was not a coward. He was also not wrong about the numbers. "Are you telling me to take the deal?" Silas said. "I'm telling you that 7 people in this lot are thinking about it," Crowbar said. "And if I'm thinking about it, there are more at the clubhouse who are, and you should know that before you make a decision that commits all of them." Silas turned slightly and looked at the other 6. Read them the way he'd been reading men in groups for 3 decades. The weight distribution, the eye contact patterns, who was watching whom, who was waiting for the answer before they committed to their own position. 2 of them he was certain about. 3 were genuinely uncertain. Crowbar was telling the truth. Decker was afraid. "Go back to the clubhouse," Silas said. Nobody moved immediately. "I'm not angry," he said, which was not entirely true, but was true enough to say. "Go back. Tonight we vote. The right way." They went. Decker last, with the specific heaviness of someone who'd expected a different kind of confrontation and didn't know what to do with the absence of it. Silas stood in the empty lot and lit a cigarette. He hadn't smoked in 4 months and stared at the tire shop's dead sign until the cherry burned down to his fingers. He didn't take the deal. He was never going to take the deal. But Crowbar had given him something more valuable than a warning. He'd given him the count. And the count meant Silas had to make a different kind of move before the vote happened, or the vote wouldn't go his way. He drove to the edge of town and made a call he'd been avoiding for 3 years. The phone rang 4 times. Then, "This number doesn't exist anymore." "It's me," Silas said. A pause. The sound of a hand covering a receiver, muffled movement. Then, "You told me never to expect this call." "I told you a lot of things," Silas said. "I need to talk to Maricela." Another pause, longer. The voice on the other end belonged to a man named Philo, who operated somewhere in the distance between legitimate private investigation and the kind of information brokerage that didn't appear on business cards. Silas had used him 3 times in 20 years. Philo's memory was perfect, and his discretion was absolute, and the reason for the latter was that he knew Silas knew things about his past, that Philo would prefer stay historical. "Maricela left Pell's operation 6 months ago," Philo said. "She's not easy to reach." "I know. That's why I'm calling you." "What do you need?" "Everything she knows about his leverage structure, how he holds people, what he uses." Silas paused. "And I need to know if there's a name. Someone inside the operation who's been feeding him information about Iron Mercy from the inside." The silence on Philo's end was different from ordinary silence. It was the silence of a man choosing between 2 things he didn't want to say. "I'll make calls," Philo said finally. 48 hours. "I need 24. "Then I'll do what I can in 24. A beat. "Silas, be careful with what Maricela knows. She left Pell's operation because he stopped letting her leave the building. That's the kind of thing a person carries." The call ended. Silas sat on his bike on the empty access road and thought about leverage structures, about the 7 men in the tire shop lot, about a corkboard cleared in a hurry before Elena Rowan was allowed to see it, about what had been on it that he hadn't wanted her to read. The vote happened at 8 that night. 23 members present, 3 absent, 2 on road, 1 hospitalized with something unrelated to any of this. The clubhouse was crowded in the particular way of rooms that are too full of tension to feel physically occupied. People stood along the walls. The pool tables were pushed back. The central table had the Iron Mercy charter on it, worn at the fold lines. The ink on the founding signatures faded to the color of old bruises. Silas stood at the head of the table and did not give a speech. He had never given speeches. What he did was lay out the situation, Pell's offer, the surveillance, the 7 in the tire shop, and then the thing he'd been carrying all day that he hadn't said to anyone yet. 3 months ago, he said, I found out that someone was running information out of this club to an outside party. Meeting schedules, route patterns, membership count. He let that land. The room's temperature changed in a specific way, not louder, not more movement, but a specific change in the quality of the stillness. I didn't say anything because I didn't have enough to name a name. I handled it by changing the information flow, routing different things to different people, seeing what came back. I have enough now. He paused. Almost. The room was completely still. The vote tonight is not about Pell's deal, Silas said. The vote tonight is about whether you want to find out who it is or whether you'd rather take the deal and never know. He looked around the table. Because those are the options. Take the deal, the information leaks stop because there's nothing to leak. Or vote to stay, and I'll find the source within the week. And when I do, we'll deal with it the way we've always dealt with it. The vote was 21-2. Nobody asked who voted which way. That wasn't how it worked. The 2 dissenting votes sat with their result without comment, and the 21 who'd voted to stay did not celebrate, because they understood that what they'd voted for was harder and more dangerous, and led to a place nobody could see clearly from here. Silas looked at Decker across the table. Decker looked back. His jaw was tight, and his eyes were doing the thing eyes do when a person is working out whether they are relieved or trapped and keeps arriving at both simultaneously. Silas moved on. He started talking logistics. 24 hours later, Philo called back. Silas took it in the parking lot, standing between his bike and the chain-link fence with the night pressing down cold and the highway sound carrying from the west. He didn't write anything down. He listened. When the call ended, he stood very still for a long time. Maricela, former bookkeeper for Garrett Pell's operation, the woman who had handled the ledgers that tracked Pell's leverage holdings with the same impersonal precision a hospital uses for patient records, had given Philo 3 things. First, a list of names Pell held pressure over, individuals connected to operations he'd absorbed or was currently absorbing, the specific mechanism of that pressure varying by person, but always leveraging something the person could not afford to have surfaced. Second, confirmation that there was an informant embedded in Iron Mercy, and that the informant had been placed before the current conflict, meaning the infiltration predated Pell's offer, which meant the offer had been constructed with knowledge of Iron Mercy's internal vulnerabilities. Third, a name. The name was not Decker. The name was not anyone Silas had been watching. The name was someone who had been with Iron Mercy for 9 years and had sat at the table during every strategic conversation for 7 of them, and whose vote tonight had been one of the 21. Silas stood in the parking lot with the cold on his face and went through everything that man had been present for. Every decision, every route change, every personnel shift, 9 years of it, sitting in the room, nodding along. He went back inside, crossed the main room, found the man in question, Reyes, treasurer, 9 years patched, the kind of quiet and reliable presence you stop actively observing because he never gives you a reason, sitting at the bar with a beer he hadn't opened. Silas sat beside him, didn't look at him, just sat. Reyes's hand moved slightly on the beer bottle, just slightly. "How long has he had something on you?" Silas said, his voice barely above the ambient noise of the room. Reyes said nothing for a long time. The beer bottle was cold and wet under his fingers. The room was busy around them, nobody looking, the ordinary chaos of a clubhouse evening providing perfect cover for a conversation that was going to change everything. "Since before you brought me in," Reyes said finally. His voice was flat and old and tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. Silas absorbed that. Before. Which meant Reyes had been placed before his recruitment. Which meant the recruitment itself had been engineered. Which meant Pell's investment in Iron Mercy predated the current conflict by nearly a decade. "What does he have?" Silas said. "My brother," Reyes said. "He's got my brother." The noise of the room continued around them. Someone broke a rack on the pool table. The jukebox in the corner cycled to a new song. Silas sat with his elbows on the bar and looked at the middle distance and felt the shape of the last 9 years rearrange itself into something he didn't have a name for yet. "Is your brother alive?" he said. "Last time I knew." Reyes's jaw moved. "Silas, I didn't. The information I gave him, I made it small. Root changes that didn't matter. Numbers that were off by enough to—" He stopped. "It didn't stay small." "No," Silas agreed. "It didn't." They sat in the loud, ordinary room, and the specific weight of it, 9 years, one brother, everything it had cost everyone it had touched, sat between them like something that hadn't decided yet what shape it was going to take. "I can't fix what I did," Reyes said. "You're not going to try," Silas said. "You're going to help me find where he's keeping your brother." He turned and looked at Reyes directly for the first time. "And then you're going to help me end this before he uses the girl." Reyes looked at him with eyes that had the specific quality of someone who has been holding a terrible secret for so long that the relief of releasing it and the terror of what comes next arrive simultaneously and cancel each other out, leaving just an emptiness that might, eventually, become something else. He already decided about the girl, Reyes said. The cold moved through Silas Crowe from the inside. "What do you mean?" he said, and it was not a question. "The surveillance on the house." Reyes's voice dropped to almost nothing. "It wasn't to get to you, not directly. He knows you won't fold for yourself. He figured that out 6 months ago. The girl is the offer. He's going to take her, and then the call he makes isn't going to be about the routes." Reyes paused, swallowed. "He's going to offer to give her back in exchange for you stepping down, publicly, permanently. Disbanding the club on record. Everything you've built, dissolved, so he can walk into the vacuum without resistance." Silas stared at him. "He wanted the brotherhood gone," Reyes said. "Not absorbed. Gone. Because absorbed means you keep existing somewhere, and Pell doesn't want anything that could reorganize. He wants empty road." "When?" Silas said. Reyes's hands were shaking now, just barely, the tremor of a man who has carried a thing so long that setting it down makes his whole system unsure of its own weight. He's been waiting for a window, a moment when the surveillance tells him she's exposed and the watch on her is thin. He paused. "There was a schedule change at the school. Early dismissal Friday. He knows about it." Today was Wednesday. Silas stood. He didn't rush. He didn't raise his voice. He turned and scanned the room with the specific, focused clarity of a man who has just watched the radius of his problem collapse from weeks to 36 hours, and who has exactly as much time as it takes to cross the room before everything changes. He found Boone at the pool table and said 3 words. Boone set down his cue. Silas found Crowbar by the side door and said 4 words. Crowbar's face went still and specific, the face of a road captain receiving a new operational reality and filing the old one instantly away. Silas went back through the clubhouse, through the back room, out the side door into the cold, and stood in the gravel lot with the highway sound and the night air, and 36 hours between him and a man who had been planning this for 9 years. He took out his phone, pulled up the number he'd written on the edge of the map. Elena picked up on the second ring. She sounded like someone who hadn't been sleeping well for several nights running and had stopped pretending otherwise. "Something's changed," he said. "I can tell," she said. "What?" "I need you and Maya at the clubhouse tonight, both of you, now." A pause. The sound of her processing it, the cost of it, the logic of it, the fear underneath both. "What happened?" "He moved the timeline," Silas said. "We have 36 hours. Another pause, shorter. "How long do we stay?" "Until it's over." He heard her breathe, once, deliberately, the breath of a woman making the calculation of which danger is larger and arriving at her answer. Then the sound of her moving, the scrape of keys from a counter, footsteps on a wooden floor. "We'll be there in 20 minutes, Elena said. The call ended. Silas stood in the cold parking lot and looked at the dark sky above the industrial access road, and somewhere on the other side of town, in a building Reyes was about to help him identify, Garrett Pell was sitting in a room where everything was arranged exactly the way he wanted it. 9 years of patience, 1 informant, 1 8-year-old girl, and a plan so thoroughly constructed that the only piece it hadn't accounted for was the possibility that the man it was built around might have already found the seam. Inside the clubhouse, the jukebox played on, and the pool balls cracked, and the Iron Mercy Riders moved through their ordinary Wednesday evening with no idea that somewhere in the machinery of the night, a clock had just started running and would not stop until Friday brought either a rescue or a reckoning that none of them would survive unchanged. Reyes sat at the bar with his unopened beer and his shaking hands, and the specific terrible relief of a man who has just transferred the weight of a secret to someone larger than himself, not knowing yet whether that transfer was salvation or simply a different kind of collapse, the kind that takes everyone down together when it finally lets go. Elena arrived in 19 minutes. Silas watched her pull into the lot from the side door, headlights cutting through the cold air in 2 pale columns that swept the chain link and the gravel and the line of parked Harleys before she killed the engine. She sat in the car for exactly 4 seconds. He counted, not because the counting mattered, but because it told him something about her. The way she used those 4 seconds to complete whatever internal transition she needed before opening the door and becoming someone who could walk into a situation without showing the cost of walking into it. Maya was asleep in the back seat, lime green backpack on the seat beside her like a faithful dog. Elena got out. She had a duffel bag over one shoulder and the particular expression of a woman who has packed for contingency before and doesn't need to be told what contingency requires. She looked at Silas. He looked at her. Neither of them wasted time on anything preliminary. "Tell me while we get her inside," Elena said. He took the duffel. She carried Maya, the girl heavy and loose-limbed with sleep, head against her mother's shoulder, completely unaware, and Silas talked as they walked. He gave her the essential shape, the informant, the timeline, Friday's early dismissal, the actual endgame. Not roots, not absorption, dissolution. He watched Elena's face as she processed it and saw the moment she moved from alarmed to something colder and more functional than alarm. She didn't ask questions until Maya was settled on a cot in the back room, still asleep, the frog backpack on the floor beside her. Then she turned to Silas in the doorway and said, "Who's Reyes?" He told her. She absorbed it. Her jaw moved once. 9 years. 9 years. And you didn't know. I suspected something was wrong with the information flow. I didn't know it went back that far. He paused. Nobody did. Elena looked at Maya sleeping, at the lime green backpack, at the concrete floor and the single lamp casting its inadequate light over the cot. "Where is he now?" "Reyes, front room. Boone's with him. Is he safe?" "For now." "For now," she repeated, not as a question, as a notation. She filed it and moved on. "What's the plan for 36 hours? We find where Pell is keeping Reyes's brother. We use that location to map Pell's operational center. We move before he does." Silas leaned against the doorframe. "Reyes has fragments, things he overheard, references Pell's people made in his presence when they thought he was just infrastructure. We're pulling those together now." "And if the fragments aren't enough?" Silas didn't answer immediately, and the not answering was itself an answer that Elena recognized and didn't push on. "Get some sleep," he said. "I'll be in the front room." "I won't sleep." "I know. Try anyway." He left her in the doorway. She stayed there for a while, watching Maya breathe, before she finally sat on the floor with her back against the wall and her knees pulled up and her eyes open in the dark. Reyes talked for 2 hours. He sat at the central table with a mug of coffee he didn't drink, and Silas across from him and Crowbar to the side, and Boone standing at the wall because Boone stood at walls the way some men sit in chairs, naturally, as a default state. Reyes talked, and the other 3 men listened with the specific quality of attention that separates people who are gathering information from people who are simply waiting for their turn to speak. What emerged was not a clean picture. It was the kind of picture you get when someone has been living inside a situation for 9 years and compartmentalizing the pieces to survive it. Fragmentary, non-linear, with holes where fear had made memory unreliable, and islands of precise detail where specific moments had burned themselves in with the clarity that only genuine terror produces. Pell's operation was larger than any of them had mapped. Not a rival motorcycle organization. That framing had been the first mistake, and Reyes laid out why with the methodical guilt of a man who has spent years understanding exactly what his silence had cost. The Wrecking Tide was a transit organization. Motorcycles were peripheral, branding, intimidation, the useful optics of a biker gang for situations where that read was helpful. The actual architecture was logistics, warehousing, route management, commercial vehicle infiltration. Pell had spent a decade building it and had reached the point where the last significant gap in his network was the stretch of county roads and rural routes that Iron Mercy had developed over 22 years. Roads that bypassed commercial way stations, that had relationships with property owners along them, that existed in the unofficial geography of trust and long-standing arrangement that couldn't be purchased or duplicated, only inherited. That was what Pell wanted, not the men, the roads. And Reyes's brother, Marco, 34, a schoolteacher in Fresno who had nothing to do with any of this and had been taken 18 months ago during what the police report called a home invasion, the kind of case that generated a file and then quietly stopped generating anything. Marco was the guarantor of Reyes's cooperation, held in a location Reyes had never been allowed to know, but whose general geography he had been able to narrow, over 18 months of careful listening, to an industrial area in the eastern part of the county. Crowbar spread the county map on the table during the second hour. Reyes pointed, hesitated, pointed again. "There's a cold storage facility," Reyes said, "on Industrial Corridor 6. Pell's people mentioned it twice in the context of, they called it the library. Places they kept things they needed to be able to produce on short notice." He paused. "People would be things." Crowbar put his finger on the map. Industrial Corridor 6. A cluster of commercial and light industrial properties in the eastern flatlands, accessed by 2 roads, both of which Silas had ridden enough times to know their conditions in his sleep. "How many people does Pell run in a facility like that?" Silas said. "I don't know. I never saw operational details. Just, the library came up in the context of a capacity issue, something about moving people when the count got above a certain number." Reyes's voice was flat and precise in the way of someone reporting facts they hate. "I don't know what the number was." Silas looked at the map. Crowbar looked at Silas. "We'd be going in with no internal intelligence," Crowbar said. "No count, no layout, no exit mapping." "I know," Silas said. "That's how people get killed." "I know that too." The room held its breath for a moment. Then Silas said, "Get Philo back on the line. I need satellite imagery of that corridor from the last 6 months. Commercial, not government. Philo knows the sources." He looked at Boone. "And I need to know if we have anyone with facility security experience. Not theoretical. Worked it." Boone thought for a moment. "Dix. Dix left last spring. He left the club. He didn't leave the county." Boone's expression was neutral. "I can find him." Silas nodded. The planning moved forward into its next phase, and Reyes sat at the edge of it with his untouched coffee and the expression of a man watching people work to fix something he broke, unable to do anything about either the fixing or the breaking. It was just past 2 in the morning when Philo delivered the satellite imagery. Not prints, a shared folder, Crowbar pulling it up on the laptop that lived on the backroom desk and projecting it against the cleared corkboard wall with a portable unit someone produced from a cabinet. The images were commercial satellite, irregular timestamps over 6 months. The resolution adequate for exterior structure mapping, if not interior detail. Industrial Corridor 6 showed 3 significant structures. One was clearly active, loading dock traffic visible across multiple images, commercial vehicles, the kind of regular movement pattern that suggested legitimate warehousing. The second was partially collapsed and had been for at least 4 of the 6 months. The third was the cold storage facility Reyes had indicated, a long, low structure with a single vehicle access point on the west side and what appeared to be a secondary entrance on the north face, partially obscured by an attached outbuilding. Dix arrived at 2:45, riding a bike that needed attention. Silas filed as someone else's problem, looking at the assembled brotherhood with the specific wariness of a man who had left a thing and wasn't certain whether walking back through its door was a choice or a collapse. He was 51, formerly military police, had done 2 years of contract facility security after his discharge before the work's particular moral texture had become intolerable, and he'd found iron mercy instead. He and Silas had not spoken since the spring meeting where Dix had said his piece about the direction of things and walked out with his patch folded on the table. They looked at each other across the back room. "I'm not repatching," Dix said. "I'm not asking you to," Silas said. "I'm asking for 48 hours of expertise." "What's the situation?" Silas told him, efficiently, without editorializing. Dix listened with the focused stillness of a man who spent years being paid to assess situations without the luxury of emotional response. When Silas finished, Dix was quiet for a moment. "The girl," Dix said. "She's here?" "In the back room." Dix looked at the satellite images on the corkboard, at the cold storage facility with its single vehicle access and its obscured north entrance. He looked at it the way a person looks at a problem they know how to solve but would prefer not to. Cold storage of that footprint, single road access, secondary entrance partially concealed. That's a minimum 2-entry approach, Dix said. You'd need a distraction event at the primary to pull response while a second team goes through the north face. He paused. "What's your vehicle count?" They were working through the logistics of an approach they hadn't committed to yet. The planning kept cautious distance from the decision itself. When Silas's phone buzzed on the desk, unknown number. He looked at it. Everyone in the room looked at it. The buzzing stopped. Then it started again immediately. Silas picked up, said nothing, waited. "I was going to wait until Friday," said the voice on the other end. Garrett Pels was not what you would expect from a man who held people in cold storage facilities and had spent 9 years dismantling a motorcycle brotherhood from the inside. It was moderate, reasonable, the voice of someone who has structured his entire presentation around never sounding like what he is. He spoke the way men speak when they've been in enough rooms with enough lawyers to understand that tone is its own kind of documentation. "But you moved the woman and the girl tonight," Pell continued, "which tells me you know more than you should, which means my timeline is now yours." A pause. "Hello, Silas." "Pell," Silas said. His voice was level. Around him, the room went completely still. Crowbar reached across and put the phone on speaker without being asked. Silas didn't stop him. "I want to be direct with you," Pell said, "because I respect what you've built, and I think direct conversation gets us where we're going faster than the current trajectory. I have something that belongs to someone in your organization. You now know that. I have adjusted timelines because you've responded faster than I modeled. We are now in a position where the original plan, which was clean and unhurried, needs to become something else." "What's something else?" Silas said. "A meeting, tomorrow morning. Just the two of us, so I'll give you the location, you come alone, we discuss terms." A pause. "In exchange for attending, I'll provide a photograph of Marco Reyes, current, proving the timeline of his well-being. Proof of life, I think is the term." Silas looked at Reyes. Reyes's face was the face of a man who has been handed both relief and a trap in the same sentence and cannot yet determine which weighs more. "And if I don't come," Silas said, "then we default to the operational plan I've had in place for 8 months, which has a specific Friday timing element you're already aware of." Pell's voice remained perfectly reasonable throughout this. "I don't prefer that option. I prefer the meeting. Cleaner outcomes for everyone." "I'll think about it," Silas said. "You have until 6 a.m., Pell said, and ended the call. The room was silent for a long moment. Then Dick said, "That call was traced the moment you picked up. He knows exactly where you are." Silas looked at him. "I know. Which means this location is compromised." "Yes." "Which means the girl." "I know." Silas stood. He looked at Crowbar. "We move in 2 hours. Split. The main group goes to the Delray property. Small contingent stays mobile. Elena and Maya stay mobile." He turned to Boone. "Wake everyone. Quietly." The room began to move with the controlled urgency of men who have rehearsed contingency often enough that fear doesn't precede action. Silas went to the back room. Elena was not asleep. She was sitting against the wall with her phone in her hand and her eyes at the door, and she had clearly been awake for the entire call because sound carried in concrete buildings in ways that interior walls didn't fully interrupt. "We're moving," he said. "I heard," she said. She was already standing, already reaching for Maya. "I need you to listen to Crowbar. He'll tell you where to go and what to do when you get there. Don't deviate from what he says." "Where will you be?" Silas paused. "I'm going to the meeting." Elena looked at him with the specific expression of a person who has just heard something they immediately understand is wrong and is choosing their words carefully because the wrong argument will produce the wrong response. "That's a trap," she said. "Yes. Then why?" "Because while I'm at the meeting," Silas said, "everyone else is going to Industrial Corridor 6 and bringing Marco Reyes home." He looked at her directly. "Pell needs me at the meeting to have the conversation he wants. As long as I'm in the meeting, he's not running his operational plan. His attention is on me." Elena stared at him. "And if the meeting is where he ends this?" "That's a risk," Silas said. He said it cleanly, without drama, the way you say things that are true and don't benefit from softening. Elena sat with that for 2 seconds. Then she picked up Maya. The girl stirred, murmured something, resettled against her mother's shoulder. "And the frog backpack," and she looked at Silas with an expression that was not quite fear and not quite respect and was entirely its own specific thing. "Don't you dare leave that girl without someone she trusts," Elena said quietly. He didn't answer that. He went back through the clubhouse and started the next phase of a night that had already consumed more runway than they had left. The Delray property was a farmhouse 40 minutes east, owned by a member's family, the kind of location that existed in the club's contingency architecture precisely because it had no connection to anything with Iron Mercy's name on it. Elena and Maya arrived there at 3:40 in the morning in the back of Crowbar's truck, following a route that changed twice. Maya woke during the second route change and asked no questions for 10 minutes, which was the most unnerving silence Elena had experienced all night, and then said, "Is Mr. Silas okay?" Elena kept her eyes on the dark road through the windshield. "He's working on it," she said. Maya thought about this. "He does that," she said. "Works on things when they're broken." Elena looked at her daughter in the dark of the back seat and felt the specific, overwhelming terror of a parent watching their child process a world the parent had failed to keep simple enough. "How do you know that?" she said. "Boone told me," Maya said, "when I talked to him on the road that time." Elena turned back to the windshield. "What else did Boone tell you?" "That Silas fixed the club when it was broken, that he found most of the brothers when they didn't have anywhere else, that he keeps things running when everything wants to fall apart." She paused. "He said Silas doesn't know how to stop doing that. He said it like it was sad." Crowbar drove. The dark road ran ahead of them between flat fields, and Elena Rowan sat with her daughter's words in the cold cab of a truck, heading somewhere she'd never been. And she thought about a man walking voluntarily into a meeting that might be the last meeting he ever walked out of, because it was the only move that protected everyone else. Silas arrived at the meeting location at 6:15 a.m. It was a roadside diner on the edge of the county line, the kind of place that exists in the no man's land between jurisdiction boundaries, where the county sheriff's reach becomes theoretical and state patrol coverage is a 40-minute response. Open at 5:30, 4 booths, 8 counter stools, a cook behind a partition, and a woman in her 60s who brought coffee without asking and didn't look at anyone directly. Pell was already there. Booth at the back, facing the door, coffee cup in hand, wearing a canvas jacket and looking like a regional sales manager having an early breakfast. He was 56, lean, with the kind of controlled physical presentation that spoke of a man who had decided, at some point, that appearing average was its own form of power. He had gray at his temples and good teeth and eyes that were the color of water over flat rock. Not cold, not warm, simply present and measuring. He watched Silas cross the diner without changing his expression. "Alone," he said, as Silas slid into the opposite seat. "Good." "I'm not in a mood for prologue," Silas said. "Neither am I." Pell set his coffee cup down. "I'll tell you what I want and what I'm offering, and then you can tell me what you're prepared to do, and we'll see if this is the kind of morning where people walk away from things improved." "Tell me," Silas said. Pell told him. And what he told him was, in its broad strokes, what Silas already knew. But the details, the specific legal mechanisms, the documentation already prepared, the timeline for the public dissolution announcement, the arrangement Pell had made with 2 county officials whose names he said with the casual familiarity of men referring to colleagues. Those details arrived with the weight of something that had been constructed with thoroughness and patience and resources that Iron Mercy hadn't known to account for. And then Pell said something that Silas hadn't known. "Your daughter," Pell said, "is aware of the situation." Silas went very still. "Cassandra," Pell said. 22. She goes by Cassie now. She works at a veterinary clinic in Barstow. She's been aware of who you are for about 8 months, not because she sought it out, but because I introduced the information." He paused. "She's not involved. I want to be clear about that. I have no interest in her specifically, but she knows that her father runs an outlaw motorcycle club, and she knows that the outlaw motorcycle club's current legal situation is precarious, and she is currently, not distressed exactly, but informed." Another pause. "I thought you should know that she knows." Silas sat across from Garrett Pell in a roadside diner at 6:15 in the morning and looked at a man who had spent 9 years dismantling everything he built and had now, calmly, over coffee, detonated the one piece of his life he had never allowed into any of this. His daughter, Cassandra, 22, a veterinary clinic in Barstow. He had made sure she didn't know who he was. He had made that the central organizing principle of the last 2 decades. Keep the distance, keep her clean, Let her have a life that his life couldn't contaminate. He had made that choice, and he had held it for 22 years, and now a man in a canvas jacket with good teeth was telling him it was already undone. She reached out to us, Pell said. Not to me specifically, to a community liaison organization that fronts one of my operations. She was looking for information about her father. She didn't know what she was walking into. He held up one hand, a small gesture of preemptive clarification. She's safe. She will remain safe. Whether she remains in that state of safety going forward is not specifically contingent on this conversation, but exists in the same general environment. The diner was quiet. The woman in her 60s refilled Pell's coffee without being asked and moved away without a word. Outside the window, the flat California morning was arriving in its gray and different way across a landscape that didn't care about any of this. Silas looked at Pell. He felt from somewhere very deep a specific thing rising. Not anger, which was too clean and too familiar. Something older than anger. The kind of feeling that predates the learned ability to name feelings, that operates below the level of language and has teeth. He kept his voice level. What do you want me to do? I want a signed document disbanding the Iron Mercy Riders as a registered organization, Pell said. I want the root documentation, physical copies, not digital, turned over to a third party of my choosing. I want a public statement, verifiable, that the club is dissolved by voluntary agreement, and I want you to walk away from Gila Bend Junction and not return. He paused. In exchange, Marco Reyes is released today. The surveillance on the Rowan property ends. Your daughter's exposure to my organizational interests concludes, and you personally are not further inconvenienced. Inconvenienced, Silas said. It's a generous term, Pell agreed pleasantly. I'm using it intentionally. Silas looked at his own hands on the table. He looked at them for a moment. Then he looked at Pell. I need 4 hours, he said, to arrange the documentation. Pell studied him. The assessment was brief and thorough. 4 hours, he said. Then my people will be in contact. Silas stood. He put money on the table for the coffee he hadn't ordered and walked out of the diner into the gray California morning. He sat on his bike in the parking lot for 45 seconds, long enough to do the math on what had just happened. Not the meeting, not Pell's terms, but the specific piece of information about Cassandra that Pell had placed on the table with such deliberate precision. It hadn't been accidental. Everything Pell said was calibrated. The information about Cassandra wasn't leverage in the crude sense. It was something subtler, a proof of reach, a demonstration that the perimeter Silas thought he'd maintained didn't exist the way he thought it did. His daughter had been looking for him. He pushed that aside. He would have to come back to it. It was the kind of thing you couldn't leave alone, the kind of thing that would surface at 3 in the morning for years if you didn't address it properly. But he would have to come back to it later. Later required surviving the next several hours. He took out his phone and called Crowbar. Tell me where you are, Crowbar said immediately. County Line Diner. I'm intact. He paused. The facility approach? Did Dix finalize the entry points? Working on it now. We're waiting on your call. He gave me 4 hours, Silas said. We have less than that before he realizes I wasn't buying time. I was giving you time. Move now. Move fast. He started the bike. And Crowbar. Pell has county officials in his pocket. 2 of them. When this is over, those names are going to matter. Make sure Reyes writes down everything he knows about who Pell has bought. Understood. A pause. Silas, are you... Don't, Silas said. Just move. He rode. The county road ran straight and flat under a sky the color of old concrete, and he rode it fast in the cold morning air with the engine sound filling the space where everything else was too loud to think about. He was going back to Gila Bend Junction, back to the industrial corridor, back to the place where the people who had stayed with him through 9 years of slow erosion were about to go through a door. They couldn't come back through unchanged. He was 12 minutes from the corridor when his phone buzzed. Not Crowbar, the Delray farmhouse number. He answered without stopping. What? It was Elena. And the sound of her voice, controlled, careful, with the very particular pitch of someone managing an emergency without the word emergency in any available language, dropped the temperature of the morning another 10 degrees. There's a car on the farm road, she said. It's been sitting there for 20 minutes. Maya saw it first. Silas's grip tightened on the throttle. How many? One car. Can't see occupants from the house. She paused. Silas. Boone went out to check 15 minutes ago. He hasn't come back. He didn't answer immediately. He ran the math. The car at the farm road. Boone not returning. The Delray property that existed in the club's contingency architecture, precisely because it had no connection to anything traceable to Iron Mercy. The property that shouldn't have been findable. Property that Reyes had never known about, which meant it wasn't Reyes who'd given it up, which meant there was a second leak. Elena, he said, I need you to listen to me very carefully. I'm listening, she said, perfectly steady. Take Maya. Go out the back. The field behind the property runs to a county road. Follow it east. Don't go to any location you've been to before. Keep moving. I'll find you. He paused. Don't go to the police? Why not? She said. And that was when the second piece of it arrived. The piece that Pell hadn't said in the diner. The piece that had been sitting in plain sight since Crowbar mentioned county officials with the casual ease of someone who hadn't yet understood what county officials meant in this specific context. The piece that explained how the Delray property had been found despite having no traceable connection to Iron Mercy. Because at least one of the county officials Pell owns, Silas said, works for the county sheriff's department. The sound Elena made was not fear exactly. It was the sound a person makes when they realize that the walls they thought were protecting them were never walls at all, just painted surfaces over open space, and that the fall they'd been afraid of had already been happening, slowly, in every direction, and they were only now feeling the floor come up to meet them. Go, Silas said. Now. He hit the throttle and the bike surged forward into the gray morning, and somewhere behind him in a farmhouse in the flat eastern county, a woman picked up her daughter and ran for a field she'd never crossed. And somewhere ahead of him in an industrial corridor on the edge of everything, 22 men on Harleys were moving toward a cold storage facility that held a school teacher from Fresno and the last leverage point in a 9-year campaign to erase everything the Iron Mercy Riders had ever been. And in a roadside diner on the county line, Garrett Pell finished his coffee and took out his phone and made a call with the unhurried confidence of a man who has run this play before and knows that 4 hours was never the timeline. The timeline was always the moment his opponent left the building and thought they had room to breathe, because that was the moment they stopped watching the doors they'd already passed through. And that was the only moment Garrett Pell ever needed. The cold storage facility on Industrial Corridor 6 looked exactly like the satellite images had suggested, and nothing like what any of them had prepared for emotionally. Crowbar saw it first from the access road. Long, low, the color of old bone in the gray morning light. The single vehicle entrance on the west face sealed with a rolling steel door that had been painted over so many times the surface had texture like geological strata. The attached outbuilding on the north face was a corrugated metal structure, newer than the main building, connected by a covered passage that didn't appear on any commercial property record Philo had been able to pull. There were 2 vehicles parked at the west entrance, a panel van and a pickup truck, both dark, both backed in with the specific positioning of people who think about exits. Crowbar counted the vehicles and did the math and called Silas. Silas was 11 minutes out, riding hard on the county road with the cold air hitting him like a wall and his mind running 2 tracks simultaneously. The facility ahead and Elena and Maya behind, somewhere in a field he couldn't see, moving east on a road he couldn't watch. He had no way to do both. That was the specific cruelty of the morning, the thing he kept arriving at and moving past because arriving at it and staying there was not a thing he could afford. 2 vehicles at the west face, Crowbar said, panel van and a truck. 4 people visible, 2 at the entrance, 2 moving around the north side. Could be more inside. Hold position, Silas said. Don't commit until I'm there. Dick says the north entrance is our primary. West face is too exposed. If they have anyone watching from inside, we'd be visible for 30 yards of approach. Tell Dix to set up on the north. 2 teams, north entrance and west is secondary containment. Nobody moves until I call it. Copy. A pause. Silas. Boone's not answering. The 11 minutes compressed into something that felt like a single held breath. Silas came off the county road onto Industrial Corridor 6 at a speed that was not technically compatible with the road's surface condition, corrected, and brought the bike down to something manageable as the facility came into view. Exactly as described, exactly as photographed. The two vehicles at the west entrance visible immediately, the two men beside them turning at the sound of the approaching engine. He rode past without stopping. Didn't look directly. Used his peripheral vision and the mirror and cataloged what he had. Two men, mid-30s, the specific posture of people who have been standing in a parking lot for long enough to be bored and cold, but are still attentive enough to register a motorcycle passing on the access road. Neither reached for anything, neither communicated with anyone visible, which meant they were comfortable, which meant they didn't consider a single motorcycle a threat. Good. He rode 300 yards past the facility and pulled behind a concrete retaining wall that serviced an adjacent property's storm drainage and called Crowbar. "Where are you?" he said. "North side. Dix has eyes on the secondary entrance. It's not locked. There's a padlock on the hasp, but the hasp plate is loose. One screw. Dix says a firm pull, and the whole thing opens." "Where are my people?" 15. Dix and 3 others at north. Me and 6 at west containment, staged behind the adjacent structure. 4 more mobile on the access road. A pause. "The 4 mobile have a problem. Tell me." Deputy Haynes' cruiser came down the corridor 20 minutes ago. Slow roll. Didn't stop, didn't interact, continued west. Crowbar's voice was carrying the controlled flatness of a man delivering information he doesn't like. He came back 10 minutes later from the opposite direction and parked on the county road junction, just sitting. Deputy Haynes. The man who had explained to Elena Rowan why her noise complaint wasn't quite a legal matter yet. The man who had the eyes of someone counting days to a pension, or the eyes of someone on a payroll. "He's a spotter," Silas said. "He's watching the access points and reporting. If we move on the facility, Pell knows before we're through the door." "That's my read." Silas pressed his back against the concrete retaining wall and looked at the gray sky. His ribs ached. The healing ones on the right side, the ones that had been in surgery 6 weeks ago, the ones that were not ready for this and were doing it anyway. He breathed through the ache and thought. "The Mobile 4, he said. "Can they block the county road junction without tipping Haynes that it's a block?" 2 of them could come in from the west as if they're just rolling through. Park on the service road near the junction. Haynes would see 2 bikers stopping, which is not alarming by itself. Do that. The other 2 stay staged. He pushed off the wall. "I'm going to the west entrance." "Silas." They saw 1 motorcycle pass. They're bored and cold and comfortable. 1 motorcycle coming back is a different read than 15 people converging on their door. He started walking the bike forward, keeping the engine low. "The moment I'm inside the west entrance, Dix goes through the north. Don't wait for my signal." "The signal is me going through the door." Crowbar was quiet for exactly 1 second. "That's not a plan," he said. "That's a man deciding to be the distraction." "Yes," Silas said. Another second. "Copy," Crowbar said. And said nothing more, because there was nothing more to say that the situation hadn't already said for him. Silas rode back to the west entrance at idle speed, the engine a low, steady sound in the morning quiet, and he came in off the access road and swung into the facility parking area, as if he'd done it 100 times before and had a reason to be there that didn't require explanation. The 2 men at the entrance straightened. One of them put his hand somewhere near his hip in the specific way of someone whose hand has practiced that movement. Silas stopped the bike 10 feet from them, cut the engine, got off with the deliberate ease of someone who has ridden long enough that getting off a motorcycle is less like dismounting and more like simply continuing on foot. He was wearing the Iron Mercy cut. He made no attempt to conceal it. The 2 men looked at the cut, looked at his face, looked at the cut again. "You're lost," the nearer one said. He was younger than Silas had clocked from the road. Late 20s, good build, the specific alert stillness of someone with training. Not law enforcement training, something more immediate and less procedural. "No," Silas said. "I'm here to see Pell." That landed. The 2 men exchanged a fraction of a look, the kind of look that carries a conversation in the time it takes to blink. The nearer one's hand moved again. "Pell's not here," he said. "Then I'll wait," Silas said. He took a step toward the facility entrance. Not aggressive, just forward. "Stop," the man said. Silas stopped. He looked at him. He let the silence run for a moment, the specific weighted silence of a man who is not afraid of the situation and is letting that fact communicate itself without language. Then he said very quietly, "I have something Pell wants. I came to deliver it. If you send me away without checking with him first, and he finds out you sent me away, that's a conversation I don't want to be in the room for." The two men did the fraction of a look thing again. The farther one took out a phone. That was the moment. Not a dramatic moment. No cinematic cue. No rising sound. Just a man taking out a phone to make a call, which meant his attention was splitting, which meant the man nearest Silas had a peripheral awareness problem for the next 4 seconds. Silas moved. He covered the distance to the facility's rolling steel door in 3 steps, hit the manual release handle on the right side of the frame. It was there because code required it, because even Pell's people didn't think a single motorcycle would produce a man who knew how loading dock doors worked. And the door went up with a grinding metal sound that was loud enough to be heard from the north side of the building. That was Dix's signal. The inside of the cold storage facility was not cold. Whatever refrigeration system had once operated here had been decommissioned, the insulated walls now simply walls. The interior. A long rectangular space lit by hanging work lights on extension cords strung from the ceiling's original track system. The light was yellow and uneven and cast shadows that moved slightly with the draft from the open door. Silas registered 3 things in immediate sequence. First, 4 more men, all positioned toward the center back of the space, all of whom had turned at the sound of the door. Second, a series of partitioned sections along the right wall, constructed from portable panels, the kind used for temporary office spaces, each with a door. 3 of the doors had padlocks. Third, Boone. Sitting against the left wall with his hands secured behind him and his head down and a cut above his eyebrow that had bled freely and dried. He was conscious. His head came up at the sound of the door. Their eyes met. Boone said nothing. He didn't need to. The expression on his face was the expression of a man who has been sitting with his failure for several hours and is currently receiving the specific complicated feeling of being found by the person whose trust he was most afraid of having cost. Behind Silas, the 2 men from the parking lot were coming through the door. In front of him, the 4 men in the facility interior were moving. He was, for a period of approximately 12 seconds, the only iron mercy in the room. He used those 12 seconds the way he'd used most of the difficult seconds of his life, by being exactly where he was and not somewhere safer. "Stop," he said, to the room, to everyone in it. Nobody stopped. The first man from the parking lot reached him from behind and got a grip on his left arm. Silas rolled with it, inside the grip, used the man's forward momentum and the turn of his own body to redirect the force sideways and down. The man didn't fall. He had the training, but he lost the grip and had to reset. And the reset cost him the position he'd had, and position was everything in a space this size. The 4 interior men were close now, 20 feet, 15. The second parking lot man was moving on Silas's right. Then the north wall exploded inward. Not literally. The hasp plate separated from its mounting with a sound like a gunshot, the corrugated panels swinging wide, and Dix came through first because Dix had spent 2 years doing exactly this kind of entry in facilities exactly this size, and his body remembered it the way bodies remember things they've rehearsed past the point of thought. Behind him, 3 more men. And from the rolling door behind Silas, Crowbar and the West containment team funneling in fast, the room suddenly containing significantly more iron mercy than anyone on Pell's side had prepared for. The 12 seconds ended. The math changed. It was not clean. It was never clean. The things that happen in a 40-foot rectangular space when 14 people are in it, and half of them are trying to prevent the other half from reaching 3 padlocked doors. Those things don't have clean edges. They have the specific ugly texture of controlled and uncontrolled physical force colliding in close quarters, of men making split-second decisions about what they're willing to absorb in order to reach something on the other side of the person in front of them. Silas took a hit to the right side. Not a punch, someone's elbow in the chaos of the middle section, catching him directly on the healing ribs. The white-hot specificity of it was extraordinary. He stayed on his feet by an act of will that had nothing to do with his body's assessment of the situation and everything to do with the 3 padlocked doors on the right wall, one of which had a school teacher from Fresno behind it who had been here for 18 months because Silas had trusted the wrong person and hadn't found out in time. He got to the doors. Crowbar appeared at his left shoulder, breathing hard, a bruise already forming along his jaw. Together they evaluated the padlocks. Combination, not key, which was worse in the short term. Crowbar stepped back and used the fire extinguisher mounted on the facility wall to address the first hasp with 2 efficient blows, and the hasp came away, and the door opened. Empty. Storage equipment, old racks, second door, same process, same result, third door. Silas hit the hasp himself, ignoring his ribs with the specific focus of a man who has decided that pain is information he can process later. The door swung open. Marco Reyes was sitting on the floor with his back against the rear wall of a space approximately 8 feet by 8 feet, lit by a single battery lantern. He was thin, noticeably thinner than the photograph Silas had seen, the photograph that was 18 months old and already showed a man who had stopped eating normally from stress. He had a beard he hadn't had in the photograph. He was wearing clothes that had been washed at some point but not recently. He was looking at the door with the specific expression of a person who has rehearsed the moment of rescue so many times that the actual event doesn't feel real yet. He looked at Silas, at the Iron Mercy cut, at the chaos in the facility behind Silas, which was resolving now, the sounds of it changing from active to conclusive. "Reyes sent you," Marco said. His voice was rough from disuse. "Your brother sent us," Silas said. "Can you walk?" "Yeah." He stood. It took a moment. His legs had the careful uncertainty of someone relearning the geometry of upright, but he stood. "Yeah, I can walk." Silas stepped back. Marco Reyes came out of the 8 by 8 space and into the yellow, uneven light of the facility, and he looked at the men around him, some of them breathing hard, one sitting against the wall being attended to. Boone on his feet now with his hands free and his face showing the particular combination of gratitude and self-recrimination that was going to need a longer conversation than this morning allowed. And Marco Reyes said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "How's my brother?" "Waiting," Silas said. "Let's go." They were outside and moving when Silas's phone buzzed. He looked at it while Crowbar ran the extraction logistics, vehicles, routing, the question of Deputy Haynes at the county road junction, which had been resolved by the mobile team in the specific way that resolved things without creating additional legal problems. Meaning Haynes's cruiser was now blocked by 2 parked motorcycles, and a conversation Haynes was being encouraged to have sitting on the ground with his hands visible. The number on the phone was Pell's. Silas answered it. "That was faster than I expected," Pell said. His voice had changed. "Not much." Pell was a controlled man, and controlled men don't broadcast. But the register was different. The reasonable sales manager quality was gone, replaced by something more direct and less processed. "Your facility's been cleared," Silas said. "Your people are contained. Haynes is sitting on the ground." He paused. "Marco Reyes is with me." A silence on the other end. Not a long one. "You've made this significantly more complicated," Pell said. "No," Silas said. "You made it complicated 9 years ago. I've made it over." "You haven't made it over," Pell said. "You've made one move in a much longer game. The county documentation I have, the legal mechanisms." "The county documentation requires 2 county officials," Silas said. "I know who they are. I know what they signed. And I have a former bookkeeper named Maricela who kept records of every transaction in your operation for 7 years and left your building 6 months ago specifically because she was building toward the moment she handed them to someone who could use them." He let that land. "I've been on the phone with a contact at the state attorney's office since 5 this morning. Maricela's records are being reviewed as we speak." Another silence, longer this time. "You're bluffing," Pell said. "You spent 9 years studying me," Silas said. "You know I don't bluff." The silence on the other end was the specific silence of a man running a calculation and arriving at a result he hadn't prepared for. Not panic. Pell was too constructed for panic. But the sound of a system encountering a variable it hadn't modeled. "The girl," Pell said. "The Rowan child. My people." "Your people at the Delray farm are dealing with Boone," Silas said. "And Boone's been sitting in a room for 6 hours being angry. I feel bad for your people." That wasn't entirely accurate. Boone had been in the facility, and the Delray situation was still unresolved, and Elena and Maya were still somewhere in a field he hadn't been able to reach. But Pell didn't know the exact shape of what Silas had and didn't have, and the confidence in Silas's voice was doing work that the facts alone couldn't do yet. "We can still have a reasonable conversation," Pell said. "We're done having conversation," Silas said. "Here's what happens now. You pull every person you have from every location connected to Elena Rowan and her daughter. You do it in the next 30 minutes. If anyone goes near that child, the call to the state attorney's office becomes a formal statement, and everything Maricela documented becomes part of a record that doesn't disappear." He paused. "You'll have time to arrange your own situation however you arrange it. That's not my business. My business was protecting these people. That's done." "And if I don't?" Pell said. "Then I stop being reasonable," Silas said. He ended the call. He stood on the access road of Industrial Corridor 6 in the flat gray California morning, with the facility behind him and 17 men around him and a school teacher from Fresno being helped into the back of a truck, and he breathed through the white-hot pain in his right side and took out his phone again. He called the number Elena had called from. It rang. 4 times. 6. He called again. On the third call, she picked up. The connection was poor. She was in a field, somewhere without signal infrastructure, the audio cutting and returning. "We're okay," she said immediately. "We're on a road. I don't know which one." "Keep moving east," he said. "I'll find you." He paused. "Is Maya—" "She's here. She's okay." A pause, then quieter. "She wants to know if you're okay." He looked down at his right side, at the cut-off vest that was going to need replacing, at his hands, which were steady, because he had decided they were going to be steady, and his body had, for now, accepted that decision. "Tell her I'm working on it," he said. A small voice in the background, distant, slightly breathless from walking, carrying the specific matter-of-fact tone of a child who has decided to be calm because the adults around her need that. "That means yes." Silas almost smiled. Almost. "Stay on the line," he said. "I'm coming." He turned to Crowbar. "Give me a vehicle, something with 4 wheels." Crowbar looked at him, at the right side, at the expression on his face. "Keys are in the truck," Crowbar said. Silas moved. Behind him, the Iron Mercy Riders held the facility and the access road in the gray morning light, 17 men on 22 years of loyalty and loss, and the specific kind of brotherhood that gets built in the space between danger and survival. Boone was on his feet. Marco Reyes was breathing free air for the first time in 18 months. Deputy Haynes was sitting on the county road with his hands visible and a decision about his future that he was going to have to make very quickly. And somewhere in the eastern flatlands, in a field between a farmhouse and a road. She didn't know. Elena Rowan was walking with her daughter and her phone pressed to her ear and a voice on the other end of it telling her to keep moving east, which was exactly what she was doing, because she had decided somewhere between leaving the farmhouse and crossing the field that the man on the other end of the line was going to be there when she got to the road, and she was not the kind of person who decided things she didn't intend to be true. The truck moved through the corridor and turned east. The morning held its flat gray light over everything. Somewhere behind the cloud layer, the sun was making its own decision about whether to arrive. And on the county road junction, Deputy Haynes looked at the 2 men standing over him and made the calculation that men make when they run out of options that don't involve consequences. And he reached into his shirt pocket with 2 fingers and produced a phone and said, "There's a number in here, Pell's direct line. I've been reporting to it for 3 years. He held the phone out. "Whatever you need." One of the men took it. 3 years. The same timeline as Reyes's brother. The same timeline as the escalation that had seemed from inside it, like a series of separate events with separate causes, but was, from outside, a single coordinated pressure campaign with a beginning and a middle and an end that Garrett Pell had been writing since before any of them knew they were characters in it. The phone went into a jacket pocket. The man holding it thought about the state attorney's office and what Silas had said, and whether that had been bluff or fact, and decided it didn't matter because either way the phone was now evidence, and evidence was the kind of thing that determined what kind of morning this turned into for everyone involved. East of the corridor, on a county road that appeared on maps as a thin gray line between fields, a truck was moving at a speed that Crowbar would have characterized as aggressive, and Silas was characterizing as necessary. The phone on the seat beside him was live, Elena's end carrying the sound of footsteps on gravel and Maya's breathing and the wind across a flat field in a California morning that was trying, slowly, to become a different kind of day. "I see a road sign," Elena said. "County Road 14. Silas looked at the map on the dash. Paper, folded, Crowbar's handwriting in the margins. Found County Road 14. It was 4 minutes away at this speed. 3, if the road held. "Stop there," he said. "I'm 3 minutes out." "Okay," Elena said. A pause. Wind. Gravel. Maya's voice saying something he couldn't fully catch, and Elena responding in the low specific register mothers use when they're managing their own fear and their child's at the same time, the voice that does not waver because the cost of wavering is too high. Then Maya's voice, closer to the phone, louder. "Mr. Silas?" "Yeah," he said. "Boone said you keep things running when everything wants to fall apart." A pause. He was right. Silas drove. The road ran east under a sky that was beginning, along its western edge, to show the first thin differentiation of gray from gray that meant the sun was making its decision after all. His ribs burned. His hands were steady on the wheel. 3 minutes on a county road between a morning that had already taken everything it was going to take and whatever came next, which was going to be different from what came before, which was going to have to be enough. 2 minutes. The road sign appeared. County Road 14, white on green, standard county issue, leaning slightly from some past vehicle impact nobody had gotten around to fixing. And beside it, on the gravel shoulder, a woman with dark circles under her eyes, and a duffel bag over one shoulder, and an 8-year-old girl with a lime green frog backpack who was standing with her arms crossed and her chin up, and the patient, unrattled expression of someone who had decided the wait was almost over and was managing it accordingly. Silas stopped the truck. Got out. The cold air hit him. Maya looked at the right side of his jacket, at the damage that had happened there, the evidence of the morning written in the material. She looked at his face. She did the fast processing thing with her dark eyes that she'd been doing since she was kneeling beside him in the gravel of Route 9, with her hands pressed flat against a wound. "That's going to need stitches," she said. "Probably," Silas said. "You should sit down." "In a minute." He looked at Elena. Elena looked at him. Between them was the morning's full weight. Everything that had happened in the last 6 hours, in the last 6 weeks, in the last 9 years that none of them had known about until yesterday. All of it sat in the space between them without needing to be named. "Is it over?" Elena said. Silas looked east, where the sky was changing, then back at her. At Maya beside her with the frog backpack and the uncomplicated, devastating composure of a child who had decided, months ago on a highway with her hands in someone else's blood, that some things were worth staying for. "The worst of it," he said. Elena nodded, once, precisely. The nod of a woman filing that answer and moving to the next thing. "Then let's go somewhere warm," she said, "and you're going to tell me everything you didn't tell me yet." He opened the truck door. Maya climbed in first, settling the frog backpack between her feet with the practiced ease of someone who had carried it through stranger mornings than this one. Elena got in. Silas walked around to the driver's side, and the cold morning air was on his face, and somewhere back on Industrial Corridor 6. The Brotherhood was moving, and Marco Reyes was breathing, and Reyes himself was in a vehicle heading toward his brother with 18 months of debt between them that might take the rest of their lives to settle. And on a county road in the flat Eastern California morning, Silas Crowe got into a truck with a woman who had followed him through a chain-link gate on nothing but necessity and an 8-year-old girl who had told him, in the gravel of Route 9, that he didn't get to decide whether he deserved saving. He started the engine. Maya, not looking up from the map she had apparently found in the door pocket and was studying with complete absorption, said, "There's a diner on Route 7. It has good pie, Boone told me." Silas looked at the map on the dash, then at the rearview mirror where a small face was comparing 2 maps with the focused seriousness of someone navigating a situation she has decided is within her competence. "Boone's never wrong about pie," Silas said. He pulled onto the road and drove west, and the morning came on behind them, slow and gray and irreversible, the way mornings always do after the kind of night that changes the shape of everything that follows. Somewhere ahead, Garrett Pell was in a building with a phone and a calculation he hadn't finished making yet, and the state attorney's office was open, and Maricella's records existed in the world, and the next move belonged to systems larger than one outlaw brotherhood on one flat California morning. But that was ahead. Right now there was Route 7, and a diner, and pie that Boone had recommended, and a child navigating by a paper map with complete confidence, and a woman who had said, "Let's go somewhere warm," like it was the simplest and most obvious thing, which it was, which it absolutely was. And Silas drove toward it with the engine steady and his hands on the wheel and the long, complicated, irreversible morning opening up in front of them like a road that had finally, after everything, decided where it was going. The rain stopped at 4:17 in the morning. Silas noticed it the way you notice silence after a sustained noise, not immediately, but in the moment after, when the absence of the thing becomes its own presence. The industrial corridor was wet and cold, and smelled like soaked concrete and something chemical underneath that. The particular odor of buildings that have been used for purposes that require drainage. The Harleys were parked in a row along the access road, engines off, their chrome surfaces catching the distant orange of a sodium lamp that had survived the night intact. Around them, men sat or stood or leaned against their bikes with the specific stillness of people who have used everything they had and are waiting to find out what's left. Crowbar had a cut across his forearm that had been wrapped with someone's bandana and would need stitches before morning. Dix was sitting on the ground with his back against a rear tire, his eyes open, doing the specific focused breathing of a man managing pain he's decided not to announce. Boone, who had been found zip-tied in the Delray farmhouse barn, alive and furious, a bruise along his jaw the size of a fist, was standing at the edge of the access road looking at the cold storage facility the way you look at something you have already broken but need to keep watching to believe it's broken. Marco Reyes was alive. He was sitting in the back of Crowbar's truck, wrapped in a moving blanket that someone had produced from a saddlebag, his hands around a thermos of coffee that had long since gone lukewarm, looking at a sky that was beginning, very slowly, to separate from black into something darker than gray. He was thinner than his brother's description had prepared any of them for. He had the eyes of someone who has been in a room with no windows for a very long time and is not yet certain that the absence of walls means freedom rather than a change of location. Reyes himself, the treasurer, the informant, the brother, was beside the truck. He hadn't touched Marco yet. He was standing 3 feet away with his arms at his sides and his jaw working in the specific way of a man who has entire libraries of things to say and no available path to any of them. Marco looked at him. "You look terrible," Marco said. Reyes made a sound. It wasn't a laugh, and it wasn't a sob, and it was entirely specific to this moment and this distance and 18 months of the worst kind of waiting. He closed the 3 feet in one step, and the two brothers held each other in the wet gravel of Industrial Corridor 6 at 4 in the morning, and nobody looked at them because some things require the respect of being unwatched. Silas stood apart from all of it, with his back against the chain-link fence at the edge of the lot, smoking the second cigarette of a night he'd intended to end at 1. His right side ached with the old reminder of the handlebar, the healed injury registering cold and exertion the way healed injuries do, with a specificity that felt like the body's own form of record-keeping. He had a split lip from the entry and a bruised set of ribs on the left side from a door frame that had arrived faster than he'd accounted for. And he was tired in a way that went below muscle and bone into something he didn't have anatomy for. Pell was in custody. Or rather, Pell was in the back of a vehicle driven by 2 men who were not law enforcement in any county-registered sense, heading toward a federal contact that Philo had activated an hour ago. The kind of contact that existed specifically for situations where local law enforcement was part of the problem. Philo had been building toward this call for 6 months. The 2 county officials, the routing documentation, the 18 months of Marco Reyes' captivity. It was the kind of package that federal interest converted from optional to urgent. Pell would survive the night. He would not survive what came after it in any form that resembled the life he'd been running. The 2 county officials were a separate problem being handled in a separate way that Silas had arranged before the approach, and did not discuss openly. Some things were handled through channels that required no announcement. He took a long pull on the cigarette and exhaled into the cold air and thought about Cassandra. 22. A veterinary clinic in Barstow. She had been looking for him. He had spent 22 years ensuring that his daughter existed in a world his life couldn't contaminate, and she had spent, he didn't know how long, But the specific verb Pell had used was reached out, which implied active, intentional, sustained, some portion of her 22 years looking for the man he'd decided she was better off not finding. He didn't know whether to be undone by that, or whether the being undone was a luxury the next several hours wouldn't permit. He filed it. He was good at filing things. He was beginning to suspect that was not entirely a virtue. His phone buzzed. Elena. "Where are you?" he said. "County Road east of the Del Rey property," she said. "Maya's asleep in a ditch. It's a very comfortable ditch. It has a blanket. She found it perfectly acceptable." A pause. "We're fine, Silas." "Are you?" He looked at the industrial corridor, at the cold storage facility with its broken north face entrance and its empty interior, at the men around their bikes, at Marco Reyes with the moving blanket, at the two brothers standing in the gravel. "It's over," he said. The silence on her end had a particular texture, the silence of a person receiving news they've been braced for in one direction and receiving it in the other, and needing a moment for the body to understand that the bracing was unnecessary. "Marco?" she said. "Alive. He's here." Another silence. "I'll wake Maya." "Elena." He paused. He had several things cued behind that pause, and most of them were things he'd spent decades not saying, and this was not the right moment for them. In a wet industrial corridor at 4 in the morning was not the right venue for any of those things. But there was one thing that didn't belong to that category. "Thank you," he said, "for trusting me, when you had no reason to." The silence was brief and specific. "Don't make me regret it," she said. And there was something in it that was not a threat and not warmth exactly, but lived in the narrow space between those two things, the space where real relationships are actually built. "Working on it," he said. She ended the call. Dawn arrived the way it does in the California flatlands, not with drama, but with a gradual shifting of light quality, gray becoming less gray, the edges of things acquiring definitions they'd lost in the dark. By 5:30, the worst of the cold had moved into a different kind of cold, the kind that comes with light and is therefore more bearable for being visible. Elena arrived in a farm truck she'd borrowed from a property along the county road. She had knocked on a door at 4:30 in the morning and explained the situation to a retired couple who had apparently decided, upon seeing her face, that this was not a situation requiring extended deliberation, with Maya in the passenger seat wrapped in a horse blanket and eating crackers from a box she'd been given by the same couple. Maya did not look like a child who had spent the night in a ditch on a county road. She looked like a child who had spent the night on an adventure that was slightly too large for her age, and was processing this with the particular 8-year-old combination of pride and manufactured casualness. She saw Silas across the corridor lot and got out of the truck before Elena had fully stopped, running across the wet gravel with the horse blanket trailing behind her like a cape, and stopped 2 feet in front of him because something in his posture or expression told her, she was perceptive in ways that still caught him off guard, that he was not ready for the full impact yet. She stood there looking at him, at the split lip, at the set of his shoulders, at the specific exhaustion that went below physical. "You went to the meeting," she said. "I did." Boone said that was dangerous. Boone was right. She was quiet for a moment. Her hands were at her sides, not reaching, giving him room he hadn't asked for but she'd correctly identified he needed. 8 years old, and she already knew when to give someone space. He thought about where she'd learned that and what the learning of it had cost her. "Is it finished?" she asked. "Yes," he said. She nodded. Once, solemnly, the nod of someone filing important information in the correct place. Then she closed the remaining 2 feet and put her arms around his waist and pressed her face against his jacket, leather, road-worn, smelling of rain and exhaust and the night, and held on with the specific grip of a child who has decided that a thing is safe enough to hold and is not going to be argued out of that decision. He put one hand on the back of her head, carefully, the way you put your hand on something that matters and is small and you are afraid of the weight of yourself against it. He looked up. Elena was standing by the truck watching them. Her expression was not the expression of a woman having a feeling. It was the expression of a woman who is very carefully not having a feeling, because if she starts, she won't be able to finish, and there are things that still need to be done before she earns the right to finish it. He understood that completely. The Iron Mercy Clubhouse on the industrial edge of Gila Bend Junction was quiet by 7 a.m. in a way that felt earned rather than empty. Men moved in and out with the deliberate slowness of people whose bodies have submitted invoices they intend to pay over several days. Dix had gotten his ribs wrapped by someone who had clearly done it before without asking who'd taught them. Crowbar's arm had been stitched by a retired paramedic who lived 3 miles from the clubhouse and answered calls at hours that suggested he had made peace with being on call forever. Marco Reyes ate half a plate of eggs and fell asleep at the table. Someone put a pillow under his head and left him there. Nobody moved the plate. Reyes, the other one, the one who had held a secret for 9 years and handed it over at the end, sat at the far end of the table and drank coffee and didn't sleep and didn't talk. And the men around him maintained the specific courtesy of not requiring him to do either. The accounting of what he'd done and what it had cost would come, but it would come in its own time in a conversation between him and Silas that neither of them had arrived at yet, and the club, the brotherhood that had survived 9 years of slow erosion and a 48-hour convergence of everything that erosion had been building toward, understood without being told that some things required the appropriate silence before they could be addressed with appropriate weight. Silas found him at 8, sat beside him, poured his own coffee, said nothing for a while. Reyes's hands were wrapped around his mug. His eyes were on the middle distance. He had the look of a man who has survived something and is not certain yet that surviving it was the outcome he wanted. "Marco's okay," Silas said finally. "I know." Reyes's voice was flat. "I watched him eat." "Eat? That's what okay looks like the first day." Silas paused. "The first day is just food and sleep. The other stuff comes later." Reyes was quiet. Then, "I should have come to you when it started. 8 years ago, when Pell first made contact and I understood what it was." He paused. "I was afraid. That's the whole of it. I was afraid of what you'd do, and I was afraid of what he'd do, and I chose the fear that felt survivable in the moment without calculating what it would compound into." His jaw tightened. "There's no version of explaining that makes it different from what it was." "No," Silas said. "There isn't." Reyes looked at him, waiting for something more, the full weight of it, the verdict, the sentence. Men who have been carrying guilt for 9 years develop a specific relationship with waiting for judgment, a posture that's almost eager for the blow because the blow is at least defined, at least finite. Silas drank his coffee, set it down. "You have a decision to make," he said, "about your patch." Reyes said nothing. "You stay or you go. That's your choice, not mine." Silas looked at him steadily. "If you stay, it's not like it was. You'll start lower and build back up over years, and some of the brothers won't make it easy. If you go, I won't chase it. You take care of Marco and you build something that isn't connected to any of this." He paused. "Either way, what you did the night you told me, that mattered. I know what it cost. I'm not erasing it." Reyes was very still. The mug in his hands was warm, and the morning was arriving through the garage door windows in long, flat angles of thin light, and the clubhouse smelled of coffee and motor oil and men who had ridden hard through a wet night and come out the other side of something. "I don't know yet," Reyes said. "You don't have to," Silas said. He stood. "Take care of your brother first." He walked away. Reyes sat with his coffee and his hands and the specific, complicated morning-after feeling of a man who expected reckoning and received instead the harder thing, latitude. The federal process moved with a speed that surprised everyone except Philo, who had apparently known for 6 months that the package he was assembling would generate urgency when it landed. By mid-morning, 2 federal vehicles were on Industrial Corridor 6. By noon, the names of the county officials had been formally transmitted through channels that insulated Iron Mercy from the process. Philo's arrangement, the mechanism of which Silas didn't ask about, because the details were the kind that became their own liability when stored in memory. Sheriff Dubrow, whose pension-counting eyes had looked through Elena Rowan at a town meeting and found nothing worth the complication, was placed on administrative leave by 4 p.m. pending investigation. The second official, a county road administrator whose connection to Pell had been the mechanism by which the Delray property's location had been identified, was arrested the same evening. Silas heard about this through Philo. He didn't celebrate it. It was the minimum that justice looked like from where he was standing, and the minimum felt like the minimum. Elena heard about Dubrow at the clubhouse, where she had spent the day because leaving had required more activation energy than staying, and because Maya had installed herself in the main room with a glass of orange juice and an evolving series of conversations with various Iron Mercy members who approached her with the careful deference of men who were not accustomed to children and had decided to manage their uncertainty by treating her like a small adult. She had been unfazed by this. She had strong opinions about it. When Elena heard about Dubrow, she sat down. Just sat on one of the mismatched chairs by the central table and put her hands flat on her thighs and breathed through her nose twice. The sitting lasted about 30 seconds. Then she got up and found something useful to do, because sitting was not a thing she had extensive practice with. Silas watched her from across the room. He thought about the photographs on the desk in the back room. The one of her front door, taken from the vacant lot. The angle that required patience and specific malice. He thought about the cold that had moved through her face when she'd seen them, and the way she'd locked it down immediately and asked the operational question instead of the emotional one. He thought about the 4 seconds she'd sat in the car before opening the door the night she'd brought Maya to the clubhouse, and the specific dignity of those 4 seconds. He thought about Cassandra. Again. He seemed to keep coming back. Despite the filing, the way you keep returning to a room you've left something important in without being able to name what the something is. At 2 in the afternoon, he drove to Barstow. The veterinary clinic was on a commercial strip between a hardware store and a tax preparation office, the kind of location that is entirely without pretension and therefore entirely trustworthy. He sat on his bike across the street for 12 minutes. Not composing himself, he had long since accepted that there was no composable version of this, but simply allowing himself to be a man sitting on a motorcycle outside a place where his daughter worked for the first and possibly only time before any action was required. A woman came out of the clinic in scrubs the color of pine trees. She had her mother's jaw and his eyes. He had been told this by one person who had known them both years ago and had not known it was information he would carry like this. And she moved through the parking lot with the purpose of someone who has places to be and is comfortable being in them. She didn't see him. She got into a car and drove. He sat for another minute. Then he took out his phone and, for the second time in 48 hours, called a number he had reasons not to call. It rang 3 times. Then, "Hello?" Her voice was her own. Not his, not her mother's. Her own, the specific voice of a person who has built themselves from available materials without a blueprint, the voice of someone who has been doing fine. "This is Silas Crowe," he said. "I think you've been looking for me." The silence was not empty. It was the silence of a person receiving a thing they had wanted and were now learning that wanting and receiving are not the same experience. "I know who you are," she said. Finally. Her voice steady. "I know you do," he said. "I'm sorry it came to you the way it did." Another silence, shorter. "Are you in Barstow?" He looked across the commercial strip, at the veterinary clinic, at the pine green scrub color disappearing around the corner. "I drove out," he said. "You were going to drive away without—" She stopped. He could hear her adjusting something. "I'm coming back. Stay there." She returned in 14 minutes. He was still across the street. She pulled into the clinic lot and got out and looked at him, directly, without the preparation that most encounters with Silas Crowe required. And he got off his bike and crossed the street, and they stood in the clinic parking lot in Barstow at 3 in the afternoon with 22 years of constructed distance between them and the very ordinary, very insufficient logistics of 2 people who share blood and almost nothing else, and are beginning, imperfectly, the work of figuring out what that means. He was taller than she'd expected. She didn't say that, but it was in her face, the recalibration of imagined versus actual. "You look like a biker," she said. "I am one," he said. "Was. It's complicated." He paused. "You look like yourself." She blinked. "How would you know?" "I don't," he said. "That's what I mean." He looked at her directly. The specific, careful directness of a man who has spent decades choosing his distance and is choosing, now, deliberately, not to use it. "I kept distance because I thought it protected you. I was wrong about that in ways I'm still working out." He paused. "I'm not here to ask you for anything. You were looking. I owed you the courtesy of not making you search anymore." Cassandra looked at him. She had her mother's jaw and his eyes and something entirely her own in the set of her shoulders, the particular quality of holding herself in a moment without retreating from it. "I have questions," she said. "I know. A lot of them. I know that too." She looked at the bike across the street, at the Iron Mercy patch on the jacket he'd put back on without thinking about it, habit of 22 years. At his face, the scar, the age, the exhaustion of the last 48 hours layered over a deeper fatigue she couldn't see the bottom of. "I'm not ready for all of them today," she said. "Okay," he said. "Tell me when. Can I have your number?" He wrote it on the back of a receipt he found in his jacket pocket, which was an undignified artifact for a moment of this weight. But he had nothing else, and she took it without comment and folded it with the specific care of something she intended to keep. "Silas," she said. Just his name. Testing the weight of it, the specific fit of using it to address him rather than to refer to him. "Yeah," he said. "You didn't have to drive out here today." "I know," he said. "I wanted to." He paused. "That's new for me." She almost smiled. Almost. It was a thing that lived at the corner of her mouth for a moment, and then resolved into something more reserved, more careful, the smile of a person who is not yet sure that the thing they almost smiled about is trustworthy. But it was there, he would carry it. He walked back to his bike. He didn't look back, not because he was being deliberate about it, but because looking back was the kind of thing that invited the grief of all the years that couldn't be recovered. And the years that couldn't be recovered were not the years in front of them, and the years in front of them were where his attention needed to go. He rode it back to Gila Bend Junction in the late afternoon light, with the California flatlands running out in all directions and the Harleys sound, the only thing filling the space where thinking would have been. It was Crowbar who brought up the clubhouse. 3 days later, in the morning, when the immediate aftermath had settled into the specific post-crisis state where exhaustion becomes its own kind of clarity, he brought it up over coffee at the central table with a directness that was characteristic and therefore trustworthy. "We can't go back to what we were," Crowbar said. "No," Silas agreed. "Pell's operation is gone. The routes are going to be scrutinized for a year at least. Half what we used them for wasn't the kind of thing we should still be using them for anyway." Crowbar's voice was neither sentimental nor accusatory, just honest in the particular way of a man who has been a road captain for 11 years and has developed the skill of saying what is true without the decoration of either regret or bravado. "We've been operating on borrowed legitimacy for a long time." Silas looked at him. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying we have 23 patched members, a paid-off building, a full workshop, and a reputation in this county that is currently in the process of being dramatically revised by recent events." Crowbar set his coffee down. "I'm saying we have assets and we have people, and we should probably think carefully about what we want to build with them now that the thing we were building before is finished." Silas was quiet for a moment. He thought about the last 3 days. Marco Reyes eating eggs and sleeping and slowly, incrementally, beginning to exist in a world that had walls and windows and choices about both. Dix, who had said he wasn't repatching, showing up every morning anyway to work in the shop, not out of obligation but out of the specific gravitational pull of a place where the work mattered. Boone's jaw, healing. The federal investigation proceeding through channels that no longer required Iron Mercy's involvement. Sheriff Dubrow's office operating under new management, slowly and imperfectly, but operating. He thought about Cassandra, about a number on a receipt, folded and kept. He thought about an 8-year-old in a lime green frog backpack, kneeling in road debris without trembling, pressing her hands against a wound that wasn't hers to carry, saying you don't get to decide that. "Veterans," Silas said. Crowbar waited. "We've got 6 members with service background. Dix has contacts in the veteran services world, knows where the gaps are." Silas looked at the central table, the long table with the worn charter on it, the ink faded but the document itself intact. "There are men coming back from places who need somewhere to land that isn't an institution and isn't a street. There are kids in counties like this one who need—" He stopped, restarted. "Who need someone between them and whatever's coming at them that the system either can't see or won't." Crowbar looked at him with the expression of a man who is recognizing something that has been in the room for a long time and has just been named. "The building's paid off," Crowbar said. "The building's paid off," Silas agreed. "It's a lot of work." "I know." The brothers would need to vote. They'll vote yes, Silas said. He said it not with arrogance, but with the specific confidence of a man who has spent 22 years learning to read rooms and has just read this one correctly. Crowbar picked up his coffee. When do you want to put it to them? Tonight, Silas said, before anyone changes their mind about what they survived this for. The vote was unanimous. Not 21-2. Not 23 with abstentions. Unanimous, in the specific way of decisions that feel inevitable in retrospect, as though the outcome had been there the entire time waiting for the question to catch up to it. They kept the name. Iron Mercy Riders. Because the name had weight and history and had been paid for in ways that deserved acknowledgement, and because mercy, actual mercy, the kind practiced rather than claimed, was not a bad thing to have on your back when you rode into a situation where someone needed it. The patch changed slightly. The skull came off. The compass stayed. Dix repatched the following week. He told Silas it was temporary while he figured out his next thing. He was still there 18 months later and had stopped mentioning the temporary qualifier, and nobody brought it up because some decisions announced themselves better through persistence than through words. Reyes stayed. He started lower, as Silas had said, and he built back up over months with the specific painstaking care of a man who understands that the ground he's recovering is not the same ground he lost, but adjacent territory that has its own value. Marco visited the clubhouse for the first time 4 months after Industrial Corridor 6, driving up in a car that ran well because someone had quietly ensured it ran well without asking for acknowledgement, and he sat in the main room and drank coffee and watched the men who had pulled him out of a windowless room move through the ordinary operations of a Tuesday. And at some point he said to Reyes quietly that he understood now why Reyes hadn't been able to walk away from it. Reyes didn't answer that. He didn't need to. Elena and Maya stayed in Gila Bend Junction, not because of Iron Mercy specifically, or not only because of it, but because the water pump worked, and the diner gave Elena more hours, and the landlord on Millbrook Street, whose property value had quietly increased due to improvements made overnight by men who left before sunrise, stopped threatening to raise the rent and started leaving it where it was. Maya grew up in the particular way of children who have been around complicated adults early, with a directness and a tolerance for ambiguity that most people her age found difficult to parse. She had opinions about motorcycle maintenance that she shared without being asked. She had a habit of asking men with bad posture and averted eyes what was wrong, and then waiting with the full patience of someone who has time and means it until they told her. She was 12 when she told Silas she wanted to learn to ride. He looked at her for a long time. She looked back with the specific expectant patience of a person who has already decided and is simply allowing the other party to arrive at the same place. Your mother's going to have a position on that, he said. I already talked to her, Maya said. He raised an eyebrow. She said it was your call, Maya said, perfectly neutral, watching him. He laughed. Actually laughed. Not the chest rattle that had substituted for laughter for too long, but a real one, the kind that requires something to be released rather than generated. She did not say that, he said. She said, and I'm quoting, Maya said, with the precision of a child who has been paying attention her whole life and knows the power of accuracy. If Silas thinks she's ready, I'll defer to his judgment, but if she comes home with so much as a scratch, I will hold him personally and completely accountable, and he knows what that means. Silas was quiet for a moment. That's not the same as it's my call. It's the same as it's your call, Maya said. He looked at her, 12 years old, dark eyes processing everything fast, showing none of the anxiety that most situations of this size called for. Still that quality of absolute presence, the refusal to retreat from what she'd decided to be present for, that he'd first seen in the blue-white light of a California dusk with her hands pressed flat against a wound that wasn't hers to carry. You don't get to decide that. She had been saying that, he realized, in one form or another, every day since. Not just to him. To every man in the Iron Mercy clubhouse who had decided that the worst version of themselves was the permanent version. To Reyes, who had decided he was too broken to fix. To Dix, who had decided he'd used up his membership in anything that mattered. To Boone, who had decided that speaking was less valuable than standing at walls. She hadn't said it to any of them with words. She'd said it with the specific stubborn grace of a child who had looked at a group of men the world had decided were dangerous, and concluded that dangerous and worth knowing were not mutually exclusive categories. "Saturday morning," Silas said. "Empty lot on Route 12. I'll bring the lightest bike we have." Maya nodded, once, filed it in the correct place. She turned and walked back through the clubhouse. At the door she stopped, turned. "Silas," she said. "Yeah." "Is Cassie coming next month?" His daughter had visited 3 times. The visits were short and imperfect and full of the specific awkwardness of people learning to exist in the same room without a shared history to stand on. Building the history instead, sentence by sentence, cup of coffee by cup of coffee. Maya had met her at the second visit, and the two of them had conducted a conversation that Silas had watched from across the room with the particular baffled feeling of a man watching something he didn't engineer proceed better than things he had. "She said she'd try," Silas said. Maya considered this. "She should come," she said. "She fits." Then she left. The door swung behind her, and the clubhouse sounds moved back into the space she'd vacated. The low conversation, the motorcycle components being sorted on the workbench, the coffee maker in the back corner doing its work. And Silas stood in the particular quality of a Tuesday morning that was not a crisis and did not require a decision, and had the specific texture of something he did not have a practiced name for because he had not spent enough time in it to have developed the vocabulary. He thought it might be called ordinary, the good kind. Outside on Industrial Avenue, a Harley started, then another, then a third. The sound moved out through the open garage door and down the road in the direction of the county routes. They now rode in daylight for purposes that didn't require explanation. The engine's sound was the same sound they'd always been. Big, American, resonant, the kind of sound that enters the chest rather than the ears. But the road it traveled had changed its character, still cracked, still without pretension. Still the kind of road the map sometimes forgot. But there were people on it now who remembered, and some of them wore iron mercy patches, and some of them were women who'd learned to keep the radio off and the headlights on, and one of them was 12 years old and thought that dangerous and worth knowing were not mutually exclusive. And at least one of them was 22 in a pine green scrub top looking at a folded receipt with a phone number on it and deciding slowly that the distance had already closed. The engines faded east. The morning held its ground, and on a stretch of Route 9 where the asphalt still cracked like old skin and the guardrails had been bent so many times that nobody bothered straightening them, there was no evidence remaining of the night a biker had gone off the road and a child had knelt beside him without fear. The gravel had been scattered by weather. The debris was long gone. The blood that had soaked into the shoulder that evening had been washed away by several seasons of rain. But the thing that had started there, the specific, unexpected, entirely unplanned chain of events that begins when one person decides to stay, when every sensible instinct says go. That was not the kind of thing that left evidence in gravel. It left evidence in people. In a man who had learned, late and imperfectly and at significant cost, that the people a man refuses to abandon are not a weakness in his perimeter. They are the perimeter. In a woman who had pressed her hands against a stranger's wound at the age of 8 and would spend the rest of her life, in one form or another, doing the same. In a brotherhood that had been broken and rebuilt from its fracture points into something that held weight differently. Not the weight of territory or routes or the apparatus of a life built on controlled edges, but the weight of people. Of Marco Reyes eating eggs, of Dick showing up on Tuesdays, of a receipt folded in a jacket pocket in Barstow. That was what remained of the Iron Mercy riders, when the last of the war had settled and the rain had stopped and the morning had come in the way mornings come. Without announcement, without ceremony, the light simply arriving because that is what light does when the darkness has run its course. It remains.